All right. Hello and welcome everybody to Cultivating Learning, Investigating Tribal Sovereignty Through Objects. I am so excited to be here with all of you today to have you join us in this interactive session where we're going to explore inquiry-based techniques to help students explore and understand tribal sovereignty through cultural objects. My name is Tess Porter, and I'm a digital content producer here at the Smithsonian Office of Educational Technology, the office behind the Smithsonian Learning Lab. And I'm really excited to have a fantastic guest with us here today, Renée Gokey, who is the Teacher Services Coordinator at the National Museum of the American Indian. She is our guest expert today and is going to be sharing techniques based on standards and resources to help explore this topic with us today. So I feel very lucky to have you here with us, Renée.
Thank you. I'm so glad you're joining.
This is part of a series focused on using digital museum resources for learning, the Cultivating Learning series. It's one of the series of webinars we facilitate here at the Learning Lab exploring digital museum resources in general. It leverages the Smithsonian Learning Lab, which I have a screenshot of here on the screen. And you'll find many of the resources and materials that we're sharing today in the platform. The Learning Lab, if this is your first time using the platform, is a free website designed with teachers and students in mind that enables the discovery of digital museum resources, the creation of interactive learning experiences, and the sharing of discoveries and creations with others. We'll be using the platform to share a lot of the things that we talk about during the session with you and talking a little bit less about how to get started in the platform. However, if you're interested, we have tons of resources to support you in getting started if you need them. These are available on the Help Center, which you'll see the URL for here at the bottom of the screen. It's learninglab.si.edu/help. And here you'll find things like our Getting Started guide, which will walk you through how to discover, create, and share on the lab. It's also where you'll find archived versions of all of the webinars we've run in the past and other helpful videos to help you get started teaching with digital museum resources and using the Learning Lab to do so. Now is a good time to mention that this session will be archived after it airs. So if you have to leave early, if you know someone who really wanted to watch and wasn't able to join us, you can access the archived version of this session at the same link you're watching it now after it airs. It will also be added to the Help Center, so you'll be able to find it here on this page as well. This is also not only a session that will be archived, but it's an interactive session. Renée and I really want to hear from you. A lot of what we're going to be doing today is modeling techniques for using cultural objects to explore this topic with learners. And I think Renée and I both think the best way to learn how to use a technique is to experience yourself as a learner. So we'll be asking you questions throughout today's session as we facilitate those activities. We would also love to hear your ideas for using these resources, these techniques in the classroom. We also want to hear any questions you have about what we're sharing. So maybe that's questions about how to adapt a technique to your particular environment. Maybe you're looking for other resources on this topic that the National Museum of the American Indian might have. You need some help using the Learning Lab. We'll be watching the chat throughout today's session for your ideas, your questions, your thoughts. We'll also have some time for an open Q&A at the end if you'd like to save your broader questions until then. To chat with us, you can do so using one of two methods depending on where you're joining us today. If you're joining us on YouTube, you can send questions, ideas, and more using the chat box, which you'll see to the right of the video on YouTube. And if you're joining us on Facebook, you can do the same using the comment box, which you'll see below the video on Facebook. So to get us started, this is not the opening question placeholder. It's got my older version of the slideshow. Sorry about that. But the opening question is, we would love to hear, and I'll put it in the chat, where are you joining us today? And if you're a teacher, we would love to know what you teach. Let me type that in real quick. If you feel comfortable sharing that with us in the chat, please feel free to do so. It'll help Renee and I kind of tailor this discussion to hopefully meet your needs as well. As folks begin sharing where they're joining us from and what they teach in the chat, Renee, I would love to turn it over to you.
Hi, I'm seeing some people I know in the chat. Wonderful to hear from all of you, and thank you so much for joining today. I know that it's this time of year where sometimes people are, have already closed their classroom for the summer, and so we're really, or you're in your final week. So thanks again for joining today. Oh, wonderful. Well, I'm joining from my home in Virginia, where I live and work at the National Museum of the American Indian. And I think what we'll do is just kind of share a little bit about the museum. If some of you haven't been to the National Museum of the American Indian, where I work as a teacher services coordinator. So I work on a project called Native Knowledge 360, and we call it NK360 for short. And our goal is no less than working to transform teaching and learning about Native Americans. So we've developed professional developments and some essential understanding frameworks and a lot of classroom lessons and resources ranging from student websites to student programs and a whole sort of plethora of things that you can explore online and use in your classroom. So we're here to support you in our Native Knowledge 360 education initiative. So very simply, it's to transform teaching and learning. We understand this is a generational project that, transformation takes time. And so we look forward to learning about your needs more. And I'm seeing you're from lots of different places. So it's really great to know kind of what you're teaching locally and how you can apply some of these ideas to your classroom and your students' needs. So I always like to start with a land acknowledgement. We gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands that we each gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here today. So that was written for our Washington, D.C. sort of mid-Atlantic area. And some of you may have, some land acknowledgements or use those in your classroom, or you may be new to this practice. And so we have some resources that can help support you there as well that we're happy to share. And, I always like to say that this is really a first step. So we do have a professional development that was recorded that kind of helps teachers understand that we hope that you'll maybe start with a land acknowledgement and learn about the tribes and the history in your area, but also to continue the work beyond that first land acknowledgement. And so we have some ideas to share with you there. And we hope that it develops into more collaborative and respectful relationships with Indigenous nations and communities that live around you. So I like to acknowledge the Piscataway people, and that means the people of the blended water. And you see a picture here of two Piscataway leaders in their community and their nation. So as I mentioned, I work at the Washington, D.C. location on the left-hand side. We also have an exhibition space in New York City, which you see in the center. And finally, our Cultural Resources Center in Suitland, Maryland, is really the heart of the work that we do. There, we steward over 800,000 objects in our collection, and we have photos and a lot of contemporary art as well that we are contemporary art is really the only thing that we're actively pursuing to add to our collection. In fact, we have a pretty robust repatriation policy where we're returning historical items of cultural patrimony and sacred items back to community members as well. So that's just an important thing to know. And that's part of kind of who we are at the American Indian Museum. So there's always lots of work to do. The vision and mission of our museum, our mission has really stayed the same over the years. So, we seek to have partnership with Native people and their allies. And this really means you in the classroom through a richer, more informed understanding of Native peoples. So we look at that partnership and take it very seriously. And we have a newer vision statement. So this we've had for about 3 years. So it is the equity and social justice for the Native peoples of the Western Hemisphere through education, inspiration, and empowerment. We really feel like you're part of that. I see that we have another slide about NK360, just in case you didn't catch it the first 2 times. So here's our purpose for today. So we hope to connect you to our Native Knowledge 360 at National Education Initiative through our collection. So we selected a few that you can use, and Tessa's put a nice learning lab together for us. We'll also share a little bit about our essential understandings and a few approaches that we hope that you'll use, consider, play around with, and maybe use in your own classroom and adapt for your needs. So today we hope to obtain a better understanding of the importance of tribal sovereignty, both in American history and also in the United States today. We'll do that through looking at objects from our collection and ideas related to treaties and sovereignty to spur conversation with you and share ideas for classroom application. So we really hope to hear from you on that. So our this is a picture of our Essential Understandings framework, the front cover. And this is a PDF that's available online. It can also be found in, the Learning Lab. And what we did here is we took the 10 themes of the National Council for the Social Studies. So for example, the first one is around culture. And we developed key concepts about American Indians, Native peoples, that is a tool for you to go across those 10 themes of social studies and apply them in a lot of different ways in your classroom. So it's really not a curriculum. Instead, it's a framework and a tool that provides some language you can use. And I think I mentioned that that is also available in Spanish. So the one that we selected for today, the key concept, it falls under the 5th essential understanding, which is about the 21st century classroom. And we believe, and the National Council for Social Studies believes that it should include experiences that provide for the study of interactions among American Indian individuals, groups, and institutions, and with those of other cultures and societies as well. So from that larger idea, we developed the key concept that today, American Indian governments uphold tribal sovereignty and promote tribal culture and well-being. So we'll look at the idea of tribal sovereignty. But first, I want to start with a question I think anyone can answer and that's relevant to all of us. And that is that I'd like to start with a foundational idea. What does belonging mean to you? So if you can please use the chat and share what belonging means to you. And I may jot down notes over here on the side.
I will also do the same. So I can start us off while people think through ideas and add them in the chat. I also put the question there if it's helpful as a reference. But I think for me, Renee, when you bring up the word belonging and what it means, one of the first things I think of is feeling safe. That I am somewhere that feels comfortable and safe to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And comfortable. I've heard that too. Yeah.
I see people are starting to share their thoughts here in the chat. So I'm seeing feeling part of a group, having relationships and a community of support, comfort and safety, freedom to speak and freedom to be heard, acceptance. Belonging means to me having a membership and privileges between a group or culture. A lot of ideas coming in now, thinking about identity, shared experiences, background, having a voice, being seen and heard.
Invisible. Those are great.
More about comfort. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think there's so many different levels. I'm seeing groups again, and no one group represents all of me. That's true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
These are really good ideas.
Being known to tying into those ideas shared before about being seen and heard, security, respect, voice.
Mm-hmm. These are great ideas. So there are a lot of different ways I think that we can belong. It might be about a group. It might be to a place, safe, places that we feel comfortable and secure, whether they're in our house or in the different communities that we are part of. I think the point about that, no one group represents all of me is so true. We belong in different places, and sometimes that changes over time as well. we have explored this idea of belonging in one of our lessons. It's a Northern Plains history and culture lesson. And we have this part called staging the question. And what I've done is kind of adapt this a little bit, and maybe it's something that you might consider using too. So, in that staging the question worksheet for students, they might think about how, as you can see on the left in the box, they might belong to the land. And I had a great conversation the other day with a friend, a colleague of mine, because maybe you have students who are urban, and maybe this idea of land needs a little adjustment. Maybe it's more about place, or maybe about the streets or the neighborhood where you live. So that is very adaptable. And so that's just one level of potential connections that your students might have with the place, the neighborhood. Maybe it is the land around them where they feel secure, where they feel comfortable. The second area that we explore with students is community. And as you know, some of you have mentioned, it's really that connection. It might be part of your identity. There may be some shared experiences with your communities that you're part of, shared background, shared thinking, or philosophies or religion. So there's different communities that we're part of. And finally, and I think this is especially relevant because we're looking at Native nations today and tribal sovereignty, and we'll be breaking that sort of big scary word down a little bit. But tribal citizens, they belong to nations. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But this might be just one way. Your students, may belong, they might have dual citizenship, they may be new immigrants, they may be seeking citizenship, or they may have had U.S. citizenship for a long time. So it's an experience that a lot of us can relate to, and that we might be able to adapt for our students. And you see here on the right that we have a worksheet that was adapted, and this is a student work of just showing, how they kind of connect with place. So we explored and tried to make it really accessible to younger people, and they might use pictures and different things to share that. So one way that we thought would be a really nice kind of way to start the conversation, and we'd like to do a thinking routine with it in Learning Lab, is to use the American flag, because it's such a familiar and iconic symbol of, often nationhood, and it's something that students can often very much understand. So let's hear from you. Let's do a Say, Think, Wonder with the flag that we see here. Hopefully all of you can see it pretty closely. And this routine is really nice because it's really accessible to pretty much everyone. And that's why I like it so much, and always go back to it. So if you can use the chat to just very simply tell us what you see.
So as Renee has mentioned, and as I shared in the chat, we built a Learning Lab collection to pull together all of the resources we're talking about today. So the belonging worksheet's going to be there, but this resource is there too. I'm going to put a direct link to the resource here in the chat for those of you who'd like a closer look. There's a lot of detail here that I know doesn't always come across in a video. If you open up this resource in another tab, the only thing I'd encourage you to do is don't click on the buttons on the side just yet. And this is something that I think we encourage in using this routine with in the classroom as well. There's some information here that may change your answers and the way that you look at this. We'll dive into it after starting with these questions. So I see, Renee, some observations are already coming through in response to the question. So that states replace stars in this object, that the flag is textured, not flat nor unmoving. And someone else is noting the state abbreviations as well. Something I'm noticing while we wait for more observations to come in is it looks like there's some writing here between what look like state abbreviations that some people have noticed. And I'll zoom in so folks can see more detail as they make their observations too. Others are saying, the names of indigenous groups as the field in which states are placed. There's a question here about the material. Could it be beads? Someone else is wondering if it's embroidery, thinking again about the words that they're seeing here.
These are great.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Just the observations keep coming in. Some more observations thinking about maybe tribe names on the stripes. There are also dots there too. Thinking of specific words, Potawatomi, Little River, etc.
Yeah, these are great. These are great sort of observations. And we do see, you know, the red, white, and blue. We see the state names and the, you know, abbreviations in the left. And a lot of you know more about when they became U.S. states than I did. I think that's pretty amazing. But yeah, you're noticing some specific states coming first into the Union. This is great. And, you know, there was a question, is it beaded? Maybe they are glass beads. So these are all beaded together. And there are tribal nations that are beaded in throughout both the blue section. Are parts of there's text there, and then throughout the white and the red there are tribal nations. And this was from 2002. It was made by Jenny Ann Taylor. And I wonder if you have any other wonderings about this.
So yeah, thinking about wonderings, maybe questions about what this might be, or what it makes you think about. Got a question here from Kathleen Renee. Kathleen asked, did you say which tribe the artist came from?
I did not yet. Jenny Ann Taylor was from the Ute tribe. So she was Ute. I understand that it came from Eugene, Oregon. So she may have been living in Eugene, Oregon at the time that this came into the collection. I don't know how long it took. That's a very good question, but I imagine it took a long time. And because there are 573 distinct Native nations today in the United States, you know, when she did this, there may have been in the 560s. So it certainly took quite a long time to put all of these together. So it's pretty remarkable. And the title is Morning Song, but the title is spelled M-O-U, a Morning Tribute, and it's M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. So that also leaves us, I don't know if any of you have any other wonderings.
I see a wondering that I can help answer, and it's a technical wondering. Jennifer asked about how I was able to show more detail than the original image shows. So on the Learning Lab, you have some tools to help you interact. You've seen me use the zooming tools to zoom in and out, but to navigate to this image, I use the arrow buttons here. There are 3 images that make up this resource record. The second one, I really love the definition here that helps me see the words in the blue field. So I switched to that one using the arrow key.
Such a great tool. Yeah.
There are some wonderings here about receiving. Yeah, Renee, you might have seen that one too. And then also thinking about, you know, the production of it as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting about the connection if it was made shortly after 9/11. And what does patriotic mean for everybody in our country? Yeah. And, you know, that's a question that's very relevant today too, right? You know, so it can mean a lot of different types of things. How are the words in the fabric? So they are beaded in, and I'm not sure if Jenny used a, you know, kind of a single stitch, or, I'm wondering if maybe she used a loom for this piece. It is a flat piece, although it's not flat, but it's not, like what we call a peyote stitch that would be around something. So it is, my guess is that it may have been on the loom. Yeah. And this is, any way we can get a print of this beautiful symbol? It's a great question. I mean, I think you can use it, in your classroom, right, Tess? And
yeah, so you can use this image for educational purposes. So that could include printing it out to share in your classroom. It could also mean downloading it to put into a PowerPoint, if that's your preferred method of teaching. When you're looking at this resource in our Learning Lab collection, one of the buttons down here by the Zoom tools and the tools to navigate through the different views of the image is a download button. This will allow you to download the image to your computer alongside the metadata if you'd like, and it'll also give you some information about the terms of use that may apply to whatever the image is here in the Learning Lab. So I hope that helps, Susan.
And I think that's a great opportunity now for us to go back to the PowerPoint. Thank you for the conversation in the chat. And, another idea that you might add on to this idea is you could do a See, Think, Wonder. You might start with the US flag that's familiar to all students, and then, that they see a lot. And then you might be able to introduce a tribal nations flag from your region or from your area. I know some states, such as Montana, have all of the tribal nation flags at their capital flying alongside the Montana flag and the United States flag. This example is the Pamunkey Indian Tribe and Reservation flag. And it's also their what they use the term logo. And they're from Virginia. And I love this because I just think it's really especially useful for younger kids because it's very kid friendly. We see different types of animals and things. So you might even be able to do a See, Think, Wonder. Now that they've kind of, your students have warmed up with a beaded flag by Jenny Ann Taylor. And then you could use something like this from your nation and do a See, Think, Wonder. And really the takeaway here is to mention that just like people are citizens of the United States, Native American tribal members are also citizens of their tribal nation. So what is tribal sovereignty? So very simply, and it's a term that we hear a lot now, but it really just simply means the authority to self-govern. So long before Europeans did arrive here in the Western Hemisphere, it was highly populated with autonomous or self-governing native nations that engaged in trade and diplomacy, knowledge sharing. They made agreements with one another amongst nations. So when the European governments came and later the United States, they adopted these tools sometimes of diplomacy, that had been well established in the Americas for a long time. And Native American leaders showed foresight, courage, and insight in treaty negotiations by reserving certain rights for their people, and at the same time, often making really tough choices about giving up lands. So tribal sovereignty, one thing to note is that it's inherent. The United States didn't give tribal nations sovereignty. It already existed. So they simply reaffirmed through treaties that tribes were nations. And we see here an example of a very early treaty. This is before the United States came into power. So this is the front cover of one treaty, and it's from 1677. You can see it was created in May, and it was between the King and Queen of England and what they called Indian kings and queens. There were different leaders from the Mid-Atlantic region, including what's now the Pamunkey tribe, who signed this treaty. So I think it's a really, just a really fascinating front cover, and kind of gives us all an opportunity to see that, some of these early treaties, they happened in as early as 1646 and 1677 with the local Mid-Atlantic tribes, and then successive treaties, of which there were hundreds, with what became the United States. So this is acknowledged in the U.S. Constitution. So if you teach the Constitution, that's another opportunity or entry point to consider taking this quote. So this is Article 6, Clause 2, and it says, all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. So that's really important language to recognize that treaties, a lot of times they might be seen as sort of dusty old relics, but instead they're supreme law of the land. So they're very important that all of us acknowledge, treaty making and the agreements that were made on both sides. So this is sort of a distinct political relationship that U.S. tribes have today. And I love how Suzanne Schoenhardt talks about them. She says, treaties are living documents that bind the nations in friendship and legally, and are the foundation for keeping promises and realizing ideals today. So rather than dusty old relics, as I said, they're very important documents, and these agreements tribes take very seriously still today. And, there have been threats to sovereignty, and tribes still work very hard to affirm and reinforce the treaty agreements that were made sometimes long ago. So I'd like to turn it back to all of you. And let's look at, before the paper treaties that I mentioned, let's look at really early forms of agreement here. So we see what's called the Hiawatha Belt. And I'd like to can we do a See, Think, Wonder for this one? Yeah. So let's do it. Let's practice again. We'll be using, objects and photography from our exhibition called Nation to Nation during the talk today. And we'll also, share some of the key messages from that exhibition. So the big idea from the exhibition is simply that U.S. Indian treaties are serious agreements, and they shaped American history and acknowledge the sovereignty of Native nations. So let's, I mentioned stepping back to a time before paper treaties, and this is really an indicative object of the first section of our exhibition because it represents pre-colonial nationhood. So we'll see some examples of early drafting of agreements between nations. And I mentioned this, alluded to this, but before Europeans, tribes and nations had our own governments and social structures, our cultural traditions, and our land. So we'll use a See, Think, Wonder here from Harvard's Project Zero that we already practiced. And I'd like you to, if you can, just share what you see in the chat when you look at this.
And again, for those of you who'd like to look at this object more closely, I shared a link in the chat for you. Like with the resource we looked at earlier, I would recommend not opening the side panels to skip ahead just yet, but I would recommend using the zooming tools in the lower left to zoom in and out and see detail. You might also flip through the other images here to take a look at some of the other views of this object. So thinking about what you see here, Renee, I'm starting to see some observations come in. Aaron says it looks sort of like a connected chain. Alexandra says different variations of purple and wonders if it's perhaps a natural fiber holding it together. Thinking about the craftsmanship and the time that it might have taken to create this object.
These are great.
Mm-hmm. Connections, potentially beadwork here. For me, one of my observations is I'm trying to make sense of the symbols I'm seeing here, and I'm wondering if is that a tree in the center, potentially at the center of these connections, these links.
That's great. Yeah, so this is a wampum belt, and wampum is a shell bead. The purple beads come from the outer ring of a quahog clamshell, and maybe you can actually get those, clams at the grocery store or fish market. I make soup from them. And the white beads are made from the whelk shell. So sort of the inner part of that shell. And these beads predate European contact, and they were used not only for adornment. You might, it might be on jewelry, and it is today as well. People might hold a string of wampum to speak with a clear mind and a good heart, and speak in an articulate way. So for important events, they might hold a string of these. And they were also used for ceremonial and diplomatic purposes. So now let's focus on what you think. Any thinkings? And some of you, already are sort of wondering what the symbols mean. What do you think about what you're seeing here? And as you do that, this part of the routine really helps students use reasoning skills, and it asks us to use evidence from what we're seeing. So what do you think about what you see? And I've seen some things, connection I've seen. And there's some symmetry, and was it used to produce to celebrate a treaty? Was this produced to celebrate a treaty or resistance? These are all good, very good questions. Yeah. I should mention, I haven't seen it yet in the chat, but contrary to a lot of people's thinking, wampum was never used as money by Native people. And, it can be also a little misleading because these are often called wampum belts, but they were never worn. They were created as mnemonic devices to remember important agreements. And you did mention connection. Yeah, and it's an important object. And indeed, it is a very, very important object. So that's great. And thinking it would take a long time to make. That's wonderful. So with our wonderings, if you have any other wonderings, and I know some of you asked before about how long it took, and I don't know exactly how long. This is a replica. The actual belt, which is kind of exciting, went back to the community itself. So that's pretty amazing. But what I like about this part of the routine is that, I'm not an expert on this particular belt. So, or on belts in general, there are people who are, but it's nice because if you just have a little background, you don't have to answer every question. It's really to build curiosity and help create more wonderings with your students. So in this case, though, with this belt, what I do know about it is that it records the coming together of the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee, or you might have heard of the Iroquois Confederacy. The story is available in a Haudenosaunee guide that we have for educators, so I can share that with you, Tess, if I haven't already, and we can share it out with all of you. And in brief, 5 nations came together: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. So from left to right, the Mohawk starting on the left, and then again the Oneida, the Onondaga represented by the pine tree, which is correct, the pine of peace, and then the Cayuga and Seneca after that. They came together with the help of the peacemaker, who made the Onondaga the center of the Confederacy. So that's why they're symbolized in the pine tree, the great pine tree, as the center of the Confederacy. And the location of each of the 5 nations on the belt represents their locations across the state of New York. So I mentioned the Mohawk, for example, being on the left and moving across to the western, from the western edge to the eastern edge. The Tuscarora joined the Haudenosaunee in the 1720s, and that's why they're called the 6 nations today. And today, the Hiawatha belt is represented on the Haudenosaunee flag, so you could go look that up. And it's very pervasive in upstate and western New York. So if you are coming from there, you might be very familiar with this as a flag itself. So thank you for all of your wonderings. Hopefully that answered some of them. And then, we might have more that you can do, bring to your students and do more with. So the next belt I just want to show briefly is an Ojibwe belt that was commissioned by the British Indian Department official William Clouse. So we see WC on the left. And it was used to recruit Native allies in the War of 1812, before the War of 1812. So we see 1807 on the right. And I think this belt, I really wanted to show it to you because it has letters and numbers. I feel like it's also very accessible to students. And also the War of 1812 may be in your curriculum. So there's another connection there. When Europeans and later Americans recognized tribal groups as nations and negotiated treaties, they recognized the tribal governments as governments, and they drew on traditional tribal protocols of diplomacy to negotiate issues of importance. So I think this belt too shows that the new United States used this as a tool as well, used a native tradition as a tool for protocol and diplomacy. So I really like that example. So in the early treaty period, and this also follows the exhibition, as I mentioned, in the early section of the treaty after the pre-colonial period, we were in serious diplomacy and early treaty making. And in the first years, treaties were really a good deal for both sides. They represented peace and friendship, and nearly 400 treaties were signed. There were about 368 that were ratified. Of those 400, and ratified just means, they were finalized and made legal between the United States and Native nations. And these treaties really hold both sides accountable, and they constitute serious diplomacy. So we sort of see that reflected here in this George Washington peace medal on the left. And if we lean in and look closely, we're seeing that they're sort of shaking hands, that they're a similar height. If, the person on the left is kind of a little bit of a generalized Native American. We can't see enough detail to really determine their tribal specificity. But we see, on the right, George Washington clasping hands with this person. And we see, too, on the right, we can start to see in this really interesting it's a painting that then became a print that's held by the Library of Congress, but we see in the print Red Jacket, a Seneca leader-in-chief, wearing an example of the George Washington peace medal in 1792. So this is pretty incredible peace medal, and we can just see the size by looking at that print. So there's a lot that we can kind of glean from looking closely at that peace medal. This particular one was used by the Wendat or Wyandotte. So the peace medal on the left is not the one that Red Jacket is wearing in the painting. But similar types of these medals were given out to different nations. It's a large peace medal, as I mentioned, and it really represents friendship and goodwill if we look at the imagery there. But then that leads us to the next section. And I imagine that you might be able to do, a comparison or a see, think, wonder with the medals. But this particular medal now, and I don't know, Tess, do we think we have time to go into the Learning Lab and explore one of the Lincoln Peace Medal?
Yes, I think so. Let me pull it up. Would you like to start with the front or the back?
I think that maybe let's look at the back.
Okay.
Because I think that really illustrates, and if we see the front, that's fine too. We can really see the imagery from this era. So now we're sort of into the next section of the exhibition, and this medal is indicative of that portion of the exhibition, Bad Axe, Bad Paper. So this era really shifted. It really shifted from the early era of peace and friendship in the beginning to, to put it simply, a land grab. So more and more land was being taken from Native people. Coercion and different tactics were being used to take more land from Native people. And Native people, now if we look at the imagery here, we see we see unsavory ways that Native people are being depicted. We see sort of the stereotype. The Native people there are little clothed. Which we know, is at this time, it's really interesting because, education was really being promoted, through boarding schools and, quote, civilization. So we see a plow and we see a horse and we see people sort of working the land. And so it's a really interesting contrast to the earlier peace medals that we saw in the beginning. So, this is an era where political status starts to be questioned. They were still, tribes were still nations, but, more fraudulent treaties started to pile up. And a lot of coercive tactics happen at this time. So in a way, it's really interesting. On the one hand, these peace medals were really coveted, and they were part of diplomacy, but the imagery starts to change on the backside of this particular medal from 1862. So some of these medals, we have an example in the collection that was given to Chief Wakamote from the Menominee. And, it's a really interesting way to look at and share this power imbalance that we see happening over time.
I see someone mentioning in the chat too that it seems like this medal is smaller than the one we looked at previously too, especially I think looking at that portrait of Red Jacket, you can see there's a big scale difference.
Yeah, that's a great observation. And that's something that I forgot to do. I was going to measure this. It was in centimeters, and I don't remember exactly what it was, because I think a little bit more in inches, but I'll have to go back. But you're right. When you see it, and there's probably information about the size in the learning lab. So it's much smaller. And that's why we really wanted to show that Red Jacket image, because you can see the size of the early peace medal. And then in comparison, the imagery hasn't only changed, but the size. So this kind of peace and friendship is becoming less important to the United States as they gain more land and more political power. So really good observation. Oh, and Jennifer shared the dimensions, 15 by 12.5 centimeters.
I was just looking and comparing to the George Washington Peace Medal. I think that one is nearly 15 by 10 centimeters, but I think the measurement included for the Lincoln Peace Medal may include just the measurement of the pouch and not the medal itself. And so I'll have to do some digging on that.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, Jennifer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I see Jennifer's thinking along the same lines too.
Yeah. And I think these are interesting samples too of Native people also, still holding on to their culture. We saw the beaded pouch. And so these medals, are, it's a little bit complicated, right? On the one hand, there's symbols of, diplomacy and, negotiation. And on the other hand, Native people, at the same time that, education and quote unquote civilization is being pushed through boarding schools and removal, this was removal period and things like that in the 1830s, a little earlier than this medal. But we have Andrew Jackson medals. Still it's really interesting that Native people at the same time are holding on to their culture in different ways alongside this, right? So it's kind of not one or another. And it's, belonging to the, growing United States while also having their citizenship as nations. So really a good conversation with students. Thank you for sharing. And we have the pouch there, you can see. And this particular medal is called the Lincoln Medal. So, I have a personal connection to some of these objects because my fifth great grandfather, Moses Keokuk, he is featured in our collection, and he was an early treaty signer. He signed a treaty in 1867, and this particular pipe tomahawk was given by his father Keokuk to his son Moses. And so it is in our collection, and these are other symbols of diplomacy. And I don't know, maybe some of you have heard of a pipe tomahawk. I think they're fairly well known and iconic symbols of diplomacy. So this is just one other, example of an object that started to be made with more frequency, especially around the French and Indian War, as the United States and Britain were allying and trying to get particular nations to side with them. They used these as diplomatic tools as well. So I wanted to share a little bit of the personal connection. So I actually went and read a treaty, which we have some samples in our lessons of transcribed treaties, and then the actual image of the treaty, just because it's kind of neat for kids to see cursive. I know my kids get really excited about cursive because it's a bit foreign now for a lot of kids today. So, showing them a snapshot and maybe looking at a transcribed, if it's much easier to read, or the actual document itself. We have some lessons that do that, and they're part of a larger inquiry. But I went in and I just started to read a treaty because my fifth great grandfather, Moses Keokuk, is in this particular photograph. So I'm technically a citizen of just one tribe. Most of us are only citizens of one tribe. And so I'm a citizen of the Eastern Shawnee tribe on my grandmother's side. And the Eastern Shawnees, the Shawnees altogether, had 16 ratified treaties from 1786 to 1867 with the United States. So I did not even tackle that. I've been doing some research on my grandfather's side, which is the Sac and Fox side. So he's a citizen there and not enrolled in the Shawnee. And so I started doing more research on my grandfather's people, the Sac and Fox, where I'm not a citizen, but I just have heritage. And I wanted to understand like the promises that were made and just more details about this, learning more about Moses Keokuk as a signatory. So I'd like us, if we can, I think it'd be really fun to do a main side and hidden thinking routine. And this really helps us in the Learning Lab just look more closely, explore ideas, and explore different types of narratives and perspectives so to sort of get at the different types of perspectives that people might be bringing, and that we ourselves, we also have to question the perspective we're bringing to the photograph. So obviously, we're all coming from a different place. And, here I have a little bit of this personal connection to this, even though he's fairly far back in my family, we are direct descendant. So I'd like to just start with, when you look at this photograph, and I gave away that this is, 1867. What do you think might be the main story here? When you just initially see, and I've never done this before with anyone. So this is really fun for me to explore. And I don't think there's a wrong answer. So please feel free to share.
Again, I put the link to this resource here in the chat if you'd like to open it up in the Learning Lab so you can zoom in. There is a lot of detail here. I'm starting to see for the first time that there is some writing.
Mm-hmm.
And as you think about what the main story might be here, you might find it interesting to lean on some of the questions that we use in See, Think, Wonder as you look for details that might give you evidence about the story that's here. So thinking again about, what do you see? What do you think about what you see? And does that make you wonder?
Yeah, and I think you give a great example of that, Tess, just by seeing the writing. And I haven't really fully explored all of the writing in there. So it's really nice to help us, just kind of focus on what we're seeing. And do I see Father de Smet over on the right? Does that say Father de Smet? I have a story about him. I don't know if
it does look like it says that.
Ooh, this is a good historical photograph to examine. That's a whole other story. We have a lesson on that I can share with everyone. But interesting, does it have anything to do with the railroads? Well, with Father de Smet, then it probably does, because he was involved with the 1851 treaty with multiple nations. It was also called the Great Smoke. And it was in the Northern Plains. So that's interesting. And we do see some Northern Plains people here. There's different tribes that are represented. I'm struck by the positioning of different groups and different manners of formal dress. Yeah, we really see some distinction here, right? If we're looking at the tribal nations, there's definitely very different types of clothing. We're seeing some Dakota people and some Northern Plains people here. You can kind of tell by some of their clothing. And we see people in kind of Western clothes too, both native and non-native. And we see the pipe tomahawk in that picture of Moses Keokuk right there. He's holding the pipe tomahawk we looked at in the collection. And he's got a bear claw necklace. So those are often cultural symbols of leadership and sometimes clan, sometimes societies that people would be part of. Yeah, so that's great. So this is a photograph that was taken on February 23rd of 1867 in front of the White House. And it was taken just 5 days after signing the treaty, February 18th in Washington, D.C., that I mentioned that I kind of explored more. So, I kind of alluded to a little bit about some of the side stories. I started to wonder. We see possibly a native boy in non-native clothing. Do we see women? These are good. These are good questions. What are the people on the lower level holding? Yeah. In some cases, on the upper levels, I know there's a pipe tomahawk that people are holding. I think they're carrying their pipes, which were used to form, by a lot of Native nations. When even during paper signings, people would smoke tobacco, which is considered a sacred plant. And the belief for a lot of nations is that when you smoke, you have to tell the truth so that your words and your thoughts and your agreements are actually carried up to the creator on the clouds of smoke. So these were solemn and sacred agreements. And so people brought their cultural traditions with them to Washington, D.C. During formal treaty signings and when U.S. Indian agents and commissioners and others came out to sign treaties. And sometimes there were religious people, like we see Father De Smet. So sometimes they learned the language of not only one or two nations, but several nations sometimes, and spent many years learning the language and sort of promoting their. In this case, he had baptism at that particular treaty signing. During the treaty signing, which was over the course of several days. Now, for this photograph, I got more curious, and so I said, how did they get here? Some got here by railroad, by rail car. Others, some would stay for a week, and others would stay. I know the Kansas people, or what's known as the Kaw today, are part of this delegation, and they stayed for over a month. And there's some really interesting newspaper articles I found about their visit here. Some might go also to New York City or Philadelphia, other seats of power when they were out on the East Coast, having traveled sometimes, for a week or more to get here. So many delegations stayed for a good amount of time while they were here. And we know that treaty signings were sometimes part of these events. And we know in this case, very much so, because it was 5 days before this photograph in front of the White House was taken. So it was really empowering to read the treaty for me. In Article 8, it talks about the removal of the tribe to a new reservation. So during this period of time and earlier, a lot of tribes were being removed. And then at this time, some of them were even being removed again after signing agreements that they would have a new reservation and new lands. Article 9 of the treaty provides for a new school building and a teacher. And Article 10 states that the U.S. will pay for a physician and medicine for 5 years after the removal of the Sac and Fox people. So I'm referring specifically to the Treaty of 1867 and the Sac and Fox, which Moses Keokuk signed. Although so much land was exchanged during this time, it's still powerful to know that the treaty, even though the terms were lopsided and unfair looking back now, it's still powerful to know the elements of the treaty and kind of read the words on the paper. Because I realized the sacrifices that my ancestors made in thinking, during very tumultuous times, thinking forward to many generations. So many of our tribes talk about this idea of 7 generations. And some people see that as making decisions now that will affect future generations, 7 generations down. Other people I've been, taught by actually a young Tlingit young man. He said in their community, they think 3 generations forward and they think 3 generations back. And then they're the 7th, they're in the center. So there's different interpretations of this, but it's really interesting, to think about how, they brought these cultural views of thinking into the future. And now I and my children are recipients of those treaties today. And really, it's not just that I inherited, it's that we all inherited these in a lot of ways, right? We all inherited these agreements. So I think that that's, there's some side and hidden stories, and I'm sure there's so many stories that we can learn about when looking at this.
The full routine, main, side, and hidden, if you'd like to explore it and the other 2 questions on your own, are included on this resource in the paperclip annotation up here. So questions for exploring in this routine: what side story you think might be going on here, what's happening around the sidelines or on the edges, and the hidden story, the story that might be obscured, neglected, or happening below the surface. So this is there for you in that collection for reference. And we'll talk more about this collection in just a moment.
Thanks for moving us along, Tess. And so finally, I wanted to talk about the final portion of the exhibition. And this is really a much more contemporary portion. It's called Great Nations Keep Their Word. So this portion, one of the sort of key objects in this section is the Dakota Access Pipeline. So that's DAPL for short. Dakota Access Pipeline mile marker. So some of you may be familiar with this event, but in 2016, more than 12,000 people from hundreds of different Indian nations and actually from around the world gathered at the Standing Rock Sioux Indian Reservation in North Dakota to oppose the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was near their reservation and which would ruin their water supplies, and it also went through a lot of sacred sites to their people. So one person, Hickory Edwards, who's Onondaga, set up this post at the protest encampment during that summer of 2016. And over the course of several months, over 150 signs were added saying that where they're from to this mile marker. So you can kind of start to see different nations there, and you see a photograph in the back of the gathering. And often they use the term water protectors. So instead of so much protesters, they really, a lot of the people who worked on, sort of on the front lines, consider themselves protectors of the water. Rather than protesting, they're protecting. They're protecting their water and their sacred sites. So this was donated to the museum and the collection. And this really leads us to the last section of the remarkable resurgence of American Indian sovereignty, especially in the last 50 years. This is just one example. But, for each nation, it means something different, sovereignty. So they are, the nation itself is prioritizing whether it's food sovereignty. There's a lot of really exciting things happening around that. There have been fish-ins in the 60s, 70s, and even today. A lot of dams are coming down in the Pacific Northwest as tribes work to protect their fishing rights in their usual and accustomed waters. And still other tribes, going back to the articles I mentioned, are working in education today, and they have their own schools and they're teaching their language. I know in our sister tribe, the Shawnee tribe, Chief Ben Barnes, said it's the year of the Shawnee language. And so we've been getting together during COVID, and we have online language classes. And, so tribes are doing different things, and they're prioritizing the ways that they want to show and express our sovereignty and also protect it today. So those are just some examples of the types of things that are happening. There's a lot of exciting work to not only prioritize the needs of their community, but sort of look towards the future too, and thinking about decisions that will affect the future generations today. So I have just a picture here of my friend Daryl Baldwin, who is the Miami Center Director, and he, is sharing and has been working for years and years on revitalizing language for the Miami people. And so they're now actually raising kids as first generation speakers for a long time of having the language sleep, what they say is sleeping and resting. So they're revitalizing, reawakening that language. And it's really exciting to see. And there's lots of examples of that. And the other reason I wanted to bring up this Pamunkey Indian tribe of Virginia flag and reintroduce it back to us is that we see here, there's a lot of outward symbols of sovereignty, but we see here their pottery. So that's, evidenced. And if you did a Sioux Think Wonder, your students might get that that's pottery, and they're seeing the fish. So we're seeing symbols of what's important to the Pamunkey. With pottery, though, there's a lot of outward signs of sovereignty, but sometimes there's things that are more for the community and they're more internal. They might be particular dances that are really done in community. There's still acts of sovereignty, cultural sovereignty, but they might not be outward facing. And so I bring this to you because we have a new lesson on the Pamunkey that should be up online in June of 2022, at the end of June. And pottery is something that we wanted to share with teachers, and the community said, this is really for us. This is really, you can teach about it, but the clay that comes from the river that's represented by the squiggly green line is the Pamunkey River. They've lived along it for thousands of years. And the clay comes from those riverbanks. And it's really important to us. And it's really, it's ours. And we've worked really hard to preserve that. So that's kind of their act of sovereignty too. It is to keep their traditions. And while we might learn about the pottery tradition, which is wonderful, it's not really, for us to always do necessarily. So I just thought it would be important to kind of mention that sometimes sovereignty is sort of outward facing and you might bring a news article in, and other times it might be more internal because they hold that very dear to their tradition and their people. So I wonder if, I know it's getting a little bit late, but I wonder, do we have time, Tess, for people to share a little bit about something, an idea that they might have had from today that they could share in their classroom?
Yeah, why don't we head into the discussion Q&A portion of this session? And I know we're a bit past the hour, so anyone who needs to leave, please feel free to leave. Again, if you joined a little bit late and missed this session is going to be archived after it airs. So, if you have to leave now but want to catch up on this discussion later, the archived version of the session will be available at the same link you're watching it now, as soon as the session ends. So please feel free to come back later. And for those of you who can stay, we'd love to continue chatting with you. So I love this question that Renee is posing here. Renee, you want to talk a little bit more?
Yeah, well, I'm actually going to share an idea from Alexandra, who I know from DC Public Libraries. I'm so glad you're joining us. And she has a great idea. She says there are a lot of wonderful books that talk about the idea of protection and water as an entity that needs protecting too, and for children. So, that's such a great idea. There's so many great books. I happened to grab one because I thought maybe if we had some English language arts teachers, but we do have one book that comes to mind is We Are Water Protectors, or We Are Protectors. And then one of my favorites is Water Walkers, which we have a professional development on. We also have, I just grabbed this one that I like so much. It's called Fry Bread, and it's for really young kids. Well, not necessarily. I think you can use picture books with older kids, but it very simply and sort of gently, but talks about that tribes are nations. It just mentions that in a sentence, and then it has all these names of different tribes on the front cover of the book. So, there's just a couple books that we mentioned. We Are Water Protectors. Thank you. Yes. We Are Water Protectors. That's a beautiful, beautiful book. So there's some books that you might use. Any other ideas that people may have across curriculum, or just one idea that they want to share with other teachers and their colleagues? And I look forward to learning from you too.
Perhaps while we wait for ideas to come in, we can share in a moment the Learning Lab collection, but we have another great idea from Madeline. Thank you. Madeline is interested in exploring the natural resources that went into making the art and artifacts that we explored today from an environmental science perspective.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I think that's a great idea, Madeline. And I should mention we have an environmental it's called American Indian Responses to the Environment. It's a student website. And so that is really well aligned with environmental science standards as well. So that's something to check out. And I can share that with you, Tess, and we can share with the teachers.
For sure. Ed's got another idea here. Ed is interested in making the techniques, producing material culture from resources available in the areas identified with various tribes and nations.
Yeah, that's a good question. Ed, what I might recommend to you there is maybe to go to a tribe's website. And I should have said that that's a really great source of information. And, maybe check in with their education and culture community and find out more about that and what would be appropriate to do with them. I think we have a few hands-on activities that we're starting to build with our early learning. So although those are more general, I think going with a specific tribe in their website and seeing what you could do there would be really helpful.
As more ideas come in, Renee, I want to make sure we don't miss it. You have an upcoming webinar that kind of dives deeper into this idea of tribal sovereignty. I'm going to bring it up on the screen. It should be linked in the description of this video. I know it's linked in the collection, which we'll talk about in a bit, that has many more rich resources to explore, but I'm going to pull this up. This great webinar opportunity is going to be coming up in July. Renee, can you tell us a little bit more about what attendees of this webinar series can expect?
Sure. So this will we'll actually have Mr. Hirsch, Mr. Mark Hirsch, one of our museum historians. He'll be talking more about sovereignty, and I think in really clear and specific ways. And we'll be exploring some of the things that you saw today. And then we'll have a whole second session on July 21st. That's sort of day 2, and we'll dive into some of the lessons that you heard about today. And so there's really specific ways that you can teach about sovereignty from our lessons, and often they follow the inquiry design model. So you'll be in for really getting both. Hopefully, both of these days. They're free and they're online. So we hope you'll join us.
So let me switch over to the Learning Lab collection now to talk a little bit more about what we've gathered here. You've seen some of the resources that we've put in here throughout today's session. So we organized this Learning Lab collection, again, linked in the description of this video, into sections based on what we ran through today. So if you remember at the very beginning, Renee shared the Native Knowledge 360 essential understandings document tied to social studies standards. That essential understandings framework is linked here for you to explore. We also included that belonging worksheet and expanding upon that question that started off our session today. So if you'd like to download this, print it out, adapt it, it's here for you. As we dive into Activity 1, we included the flag we explored alongside the Pamunkey Tribe seal. Activity 2 includes both of the wampum belts we explored. And Activity 3 includes both peace medals, the image of Red Jacket, the pipe tomahawk, and the photograph that we explored for you to explore as well. Then we used 2 different project zero thinking routines today, See, Think, Wonder, and Main Side Hidden. These are both included here for you, so if you'd like to refer back to the questions. We've also, for See, Think, Wonder, included the larger framework from Project Zero. These are suggestions from Harvard University School of Education on tips to facilitate these questions with students. Main Side Hidden hasn't been published formally online yet, but I pulled the following from a book that came out in 2020 where it was made available. It's a really great new routine from Project Zero. And then at the very end, we've gathered some additional resources. So here is where you're going to find a link to the summer webinar series. You'll find a link to Native Knowledge 360, this website that includes so many great educational materials, lesson plans, and more. There's this really great frequently asked questions section on the Native Knowledge 360 website, and there's a specific section of that that focuses on questions about tribal sovereignty. So this may be a great resource for you as you're looking to learn more, for your students too, as you bring this into the classroom and it's something new to you, you might find the answer you're looking for here. We've also linked to the Native Nation to Nation digital exhibition, which we borrowed so much of what we talked about today. There are some great digitized versions of treaties also available on this website for you to explore. And then the final resource here is a guidance on land acknowledgements, also from Native Knowledge 360, that might be helpful to you as you're looking to incorporate them into your classroom. So as we wrap up today's session, is there anything else, Renee, that you'd like to share?
I just want to thank everyone for attending and for sharing in the chat.
Yes, and I'd love to echo that too. Thank you so much for sharing and participating with us today. if you have questions, I see there's a question here about professional development. It's not one that we have a formal agreement about, but I would love to talk to you more about how we can help you get credit for this. You can email me at learninglab@si.edu. This will go to the Learning Lab team. So please feel free to reach out to me about that question. Looking ahead toward the rest of the summer, if you're interested in participating in more professional development and learning, of course, attend Renee's session. Here at the Learning Lab, we're taking a little bit of a break this summer, but we have 2 opportunities coming up that are going to be linked. One of them will be, hopefully by the end of today, on the Learning Lab homepage, which I'll show here right at the bottom. We've got 2 free professional development series coming up. One is focusing on inspiring civic engagement with 6 museums across the Smithsonian, and another is the Smithsonian National Education Summit, which is a 2-day hybrid in-person and virtual experience. I'll add the link to that one here in the chat since it's not on our homepage yet. But again, thank you all for joining. I hope this was helpful, and I hope to see you again at one of our summer events. Thank you again, Renee, for sharing your expertise and experience with us.
Thank you.
All right. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.